Thank you very much. I must say I am really pleased to be able to talk and present this session today. You know, we've spent a lot of time over the last couple of days hearing some awesome talks on animal care and management. You know, international perspectives have been absolutely inspiring. You know, looking at ways that we can improve what we do in the animal care field, particularly in the shelter environment. You know, really being focused and centred on looking after animals that come into our care and looking after them to the best of our ability. And of course, all of this is about, you know, the common goal as to why we're here, getting to zero. So it really has been fantastic. But now I'm sort of going to take you on a totally different journey, talking to you about something that not a lot of us probably in this room spend enough time thinking about and concentrating on, and that's looking after ourselves. Because let's face it, if we don't look after ourselves, we can't look after the animals that come into our care. So can I ask how many people in this room have heard of compassion fatigue? Awesome. That's one of the biggest responses I've ever gotten. So, you know, that's really encouraging in the first instance, because usually when I give this presentation and I ask that question, there's not many hands that do go up. And so when at the end of the presentation, I have people coming up to me saying, wow, you know, that's me. I've had those feelings. I've exhibited that behaviour. You know, I've felt that way, but I've not known why. So the first thing I'd like to do is just read to you a little excerpt from an article. Now, this article was written by Catherine Dobbs, who is a leader in the field of compassion fatigue in the US, and so I'm sure our US guests have heard of Catherine. And it starts a little bit like this. We are a part of an elite force of helpers, and helping professionals often engage in actions that benefit others at a cost to self. Often we don't even realise that we're making that choice, yet we put in long hours with minimum time off and barely an opportunity to participate in activities that actually refresh and fulfil us. A hobby, an event outside of work, you know, spending our spare time playing with our own animals, playing with our family, interacting with our family, or even taking in a movie. We push our bodies beyond capabilities and run our gas tanks down by taking few breaks, if any, eating only as we fly past the lunchroom, staying late and getting up early. We find images of patients or animals that we've looked after and clients that we've interacted with popping into our brains, sometimes with quite disturbing results. We burst into tears when we walk out of the shelter and get into our car to go home. We find ourselves mingling less and less with our friends, maybe even families, and seek isolation after we clock out. Our emotional stores have become depleted and we may begin to feel apathetic. After all, it hurts too much to care anymore. And the only thing that hurts more is the realisation that we ended this career because of our love of animals, and we know they need us now more than ever if we had anything less to give. So I suppose that's a pretty intense piece of writing, and some in this room will say, oh my God, yes, that's me. You know, some will think, nah, maybe I've had a few of those feelings, but, you know, I'm too busy. I'm too busy to think about that. My work is too important. You know, the animals will keep me going when I go in every day. I'll just keep soldiering on. You know, and then there'll be some in this room that's sort of sitting there thinking, God, this woman's crazy. Like, I never feel like that. I love what I do, and it doesn't affect me at all. Never had any problems. I'm coping with the job, and it's great. And, you know, sometimes I think, oh, maybe they're the lucky ones. You know, nothing affects them. But then I think, well, maybe are they lucky? You know, or these are the ones that are going to end up falling the hardest in the long run. So the area of compassion fatigue, as I said, is very widely known about in the US, but in Australia, whilst a lot of people in the industry have heard of compassion fatigue, there's not a lot of literature, there's not a lot of help, there's not a lot of resources in Australia. And so it's really, there is so much information that I can impart, and I'd love to impart on you, but obviously we've got a limited amount of time. And so what I'm going to go through in the next 20 minutes or so is just snippets of information, just food for thought, some important points and some take-home messages that I'd like to give you. So we are helpers. Every helping profession experiences thoughts and feelings that significantly contribute to compassion fatigue and burnout. It's important to know that our work is difficult and can be difficult. It's physically and mentally demanding. We all are well aware of that. And there is that quite emotional cost that is involved in our work. The resultant effects of these feelings have many labels. We're really good at labelling things. To name a few: vicarious trauma, secondary traumatic stress, secondary stress, second-hand shock. These are all terms that are used within the industry. And of course, burnout. Burnout's probably one of the ones that we have heard of the most and assimilate with most, and compassion fatigue. So I'm just going to go through some definitions and whatnot as we move along. So compassion fatigue, this is the negative aspect of working as a caregiver in the animal industry, but also in lots of other industries. It's what we call the cost of caring. So it's described in people who are exposed to the trauma and suffering of those in their care. That's where we can reach a point where we care too much, and so we become very overwhelmed and overcome with explosive behaviours, explosive feelings, or irrational feelings. Or it can go the other way, where we reach a point where we care too little. We're so bogged down and overwhelmed that we become quite cynical or apathetic to our lives in general. Burnout, it's just one component of the negative effects of caring. Often, for many years, burnout was used interchangeably with compassion fatigue, but a lot of the research and all the literature states that they're actually two very, very different things. So burnout can be associated with feelings of hopelessness, inefficiency, and feelings of being overwhelmed, as I said. It's a gradual onset of feeling ineffective in the work that you do every day, or that your work that you actually do makes no difference at all. It can be associated with very high workload or a non-supportive work environment. Work-related traumatic stress is another component of the negative effects of caring, and there's lots of different types of traumatic stress. Just to go through a few, we have primary traumatic stress, so where we are the direct target of an event. And so this might be an aggressive animal that we've had to deal with that we found quite traumatic, a distressed client or member of the public that we've had to deal with. Secondary traumatic stress, so this is a term or a condition that we've probably heard most about. And so this is where we're exposed to an event due to our relationship with the primary animal or person. And so, if we've got an animal in our shelter that has been there for a very long time, so we just heard about these aggressive dogs or dogs that are part of court cases where we're having to house them for a very long time. If their stay at our shelter is not able to be meeting their psychological and their behavioural needs, then we're trying our best to try and address those, but it just doesn't seem to be making any difference. Then obviously we can be very traumatised by that because we're not feeling like we're doing the best that we can for that animal. Vicarious trauma or second-hand shock, and so this is where it might be an animal or it might be even a colleague of ours that's really struggling, and so we're feeling very compelled to help them, and at the same time being adversely affected by the trauma that they're experiencing. And thirdly, post-traumatic stress, another one that we hear a lot about, and this is stress induced by persistent emotional stress caused by either an isolated event or a cluster of events. And of course, this is assimilated a lot with, they talk about war veterans coming home or people who work in service stations are held up by guns and all of those sorts of things where they might experience post-traumatic stress. But similarly, we can look at that sort of stress, if we've had a hoarding case where we've gone out and had to deal with a large number of animals in a very bad situation, that we then suffer some form of post-traumatic stress over. The other term that I wanted to introduce you to, so everyone's heard about compassion fatigue. How many people have heard about compassion satisfaction? One person put their hand up in the room. So, that just really indicates to me that this whole area that is so anecdotally reported in the industry is not nearly enough information on it. So compassion, satisfaction are the positive aspects about working as a caregiver. So this is the payment, okay? So compassion fatigue is the cost, compassion satisfaction is the payment. So it's about the pleasure that we derive from being able to do the work that we do every day. It's what keeps us going, what drives us to get up out of bed and go to work every day. It's focusing on what we did well during a shift, you know, what particular animal, was there a particular animal that I made a huge difference to today or this week? How many animals did I get to rehome this week, or did our shelter organisation get to rehome this week or even this month? You know, so these are the moments where you can say to yourself, it felt really good when I did X, Y, or Z. So if we look at comparing burnout and compassion fatigue, we say that burnout results from the stresses that arise from our interaction within the workplace, whereas compassion fatigue evolves specifically from the work that we do and the relationship between us and our animals or colleagues. Burnout's a bit of an easy one to fix because we can change the work environment generally. We can change policies and procedures if they don't suit and we are able to change them, or we can just change jobs. We can change jobs, but compassion fatigue will follow you. Okay, it's not isolated to a particular place of work. So why are we susceptible to compassion fatigue? The answers are obvious. Our natural human compassion and empathy, that's why we're in this industry. We're compassionate and empathetic towards animals. You know, we've all at some time or other said, I have an affinity for animals, or I love animals. And then, of course, there's the human-animal bond. And this is really strong, positive interaction and connection. It can be developed really, really quickly in a shelter environment. It has a huge emotional, psychological, physical, and somewhat spiritual benefits to both humans and animals, and it's something that every single one of us has a very strong ability to bond with these animals. So therefore, if we're thinking about the reasons that we enter the animal industry now, our main focus is to ensure the health and welfare of all animals who come to us for care. You know, we're looking at their physiological health. We're wanting to minimise pain, distress, anxiety, all of those things. We want to ensure their psychological health, you know, using behavioural intervention and certainly behaviour modification. So this intrinsic empathy is what drives us to care for animals, you know, those that cannot care for themselves. But you know what, we have a job to do, okay, and we all are sort of taught to be professional, and we must show, you know, the clients, the public, management, our colleagues, all of the people that sort of see us every day, that we can handle the severity of a given event or situation. And so we tend to employ what we call controlled empathy. And so, you know, we say to our colleagues or to our clients, you know, using words that are very empathetic, but really pushing to the background how we're actually feeling. Just so that we can get through each and every day. And this is what leads to those tearful drives at home, or certainly if you have more testosterone, it's probably incidences of road rage. So Charles Figley is another person who has done a lot of work in this arena, and he says that only compassionate, empathetic, loving and caring people suffer from compassion fatigue. And of course, as I said, these are the very people who are so vital to the animal care field. There are lots of symptoms, lots of causes of compassion fatigue. Historically, everybody thought euthanasia is what causes compassion fatigue. You know, if you're one of those people who are constantly having to perform euthanasia, then obviously that's what's causing these issues. But we now know that there are many, many, many different reasons or causes for compassion fatigue, including, you know, management issues and interactions with clients and colleagues, etc. But certainly the symptoms are all the same, you know, feelings of being overwhelmed, anger, distress, frustration, withdrawal, isolation, self-doubt, lots of different symptoms there. And so the effects of compassion fatigue, we know what our symptoms are, and then they lead into all of these different sorts of effects, and they can be mental effects, they could be physiological effects, you know, they can be things like high absenteeism in the workplace, you know, and certainly the most severe cases can lead to substance abuse, poor self-care, you know, depths of depression, which is really quite scary. move forward. The really important thing for you to remember is that compassion fatigue and burnout, as I said, are two different things, and they're cumulative. So they don't just go away after the event. So if you don't address these issues, it will desperately lead to physical and emotional exhaustion. And if I can give you an indication as to why or how I got into this area, in a life gone by, I used to do a lot of euthanasia myself, and I got to a point where I was one of those people that going, no, it never affects me, and I'm charging on, and I've got to do a job, and this is what I've got to do, and this is what I've got to do. And then one morning I woke up, and I went into the kitchen to have breakfast, and I'm standing at the cupboard, just bawling my eyes out. My husband, well, at the time he was my fiancé, come around the corner. He's like, "What's wrong?" "I don't know whether I want corn weeks or wheat bix." And he's like, "Okay, let's just get you up here." And that was sort of a turning point for me. I'm thinking, oh my God, what's wrong with me? I'm such a professional person, and I've never had any of these issues before. And that was sort of my red flag that sort of said, you need to do something about this, because obviously there's some deep-seated issues. And that began my personal journey of rehabilitation and behaviour modification. So what do we do about compassion fatigue? Awareness and acceptance is probably the biggest thing. We need to be aware that it's a very real problem in our industry. We need to accept that that's the case and look at ways to address it. We need to make sure that organisations that we work with and for take on responsibility for to making sure that our workers are educated. Supporting our colleagues, which is a really important one, so not just within our own organisation, but certainly within the field abroad, and these sorts of conferences are a really good way of doing that. And of course, most importantly, we have to address our own self-care. So as I said, educating ourselves in compassion fatigue, knowing what the signs and symptoms are, knowing our warning signs, so knowing what causes our own level of compassion fatigue. Not everybody, it doesn't affect everybody in the same way. It's not caused by the same thing for every single person. So knowing your own warning signs and what causes your most distress is really important, and knowing your level of okayness. Building relationships with our colleagues. If we know our colleagues quite well, then we can identify when they might be having issues, and similarly them for us. Recognising traumatic situations and trying to limit our trauma input where we can, which is not always an easy thing to do. And focusing on compassion satisfaction. Organisational responsibilities, what can our employers do? Again, education. Education is power, and that's probably a really key message. Risk assessments, sort of a bit of a loose one there, but what I mean by that is making sure that each area of our work is looked at in terms of what effect it may have on our employees, in terms of compassion fatigue or contributing to compassion fatigue. Ensuring safe and open communication, so making sure that your staff are able to come to you, or you feel comfortable going to your supervisor talking about feelings, because that's one of the hardest things to do, is to talk about your feelings. Staff-to-staff communication, like when talking to people whilst doing my studies, I remember one staff member at an animal control unit said, I just like to be able to come in off the road and have a good bitch. And when I'm standing in the tea room making a cup of coffee, I've had a really hard morning, and I'm talking to my colleague saying blah, 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 blah about this particular member of the public whose dog's gotten out 5 times and, they're not doing anything about it. It's irresponsible pet ownership. I don't want my boss coming in saying, stop wasting time, get moving. And so really recognising that she's not just standing there having a bitch, she's debriefing, she's getting, communicating how she's feeling, which will help in terms of not bottling this stuff up. And of course, external professional staff, which is a big one, because as I said, in Australia, it's not very well known. We don't have people who know about this stuff that we feel comfortable going to and talking to. An opt-out clause is another really good one. I'm sure most places have got, somewhere where we say, we've got a euthanasia session today. You know what, I really can't do that today. Please, somebody, can you help me out? I've had an issue at home, or my grandmother died 3 weeks ago and I just can't face that sort of thing today. So knowing that your staff can have those sorts of opt-out clauses and certainly respite for staff following any traumatic events. Supporting colleagues and self-care. Sorry, I've got 0 minutes. You know, I think that we're all here for a common reason, to help and look after the animals, but you know, it's really important that we're all here for each other as well. I'm actually not even going to go anywhere close to finishing this, but there are many ways that we can combat compassion fatigue, and there's 3 parts: coping, healing, which very little literature goes on about, and then of course prevention. So long-term strategies that we can put in place to make sure that we retain our staff, because a lot of places go through staff like nobody's business, and really 9 times out of 10 it's because they are fatigued and they just can't cope with the situation mentally. I'll let you read through these sorts of things in the proceedings, so what coping is versus healing. So healing is when we actually take the time to think about why a particular situation or event affects us the way that it does, and how can we change it or change our reaction to it rather than merely just trying to escape the pain and try and move on every day. There are some examples of coping versus healing, a few there. Strategies I've got there: education, focusing on successes, you know, saving a life, educating the public, being supportive to your colleagues. Having a positive attitude, which is not always easy, you know, knowing that you can make a difference, and consistently work at being positive and involved. Work-life balance, another one that we're all really, really bad at. Certainly I know I am. Being able to say no, you know, we're generally yes people in the animal industry. Yes, I can do that. Yes, I can help that animal. Yes, I can take that one. You know, we really need to learn to be able to set limits on ourselves. Being realistic, knowing that you can't do it all. And then, of course, that just proves all of the stuff that they were talking about this morning in terms of coalitions. You know, you can have coalitions between organisations, but, you know, really we can have these micro-coalitions with our colleagues. Initiate workplace communications, gone through all of that. Understanding that not everyone copes in the same way. So if Jenny's slamming doors, it might not just be because she's cranky. She might actually need a little bit of a cuddle. Get help when it's needed: medical, emotional, spiritual, if you're that way inclined. Taking breaks. We're all really bad at taking breaks, let alone holidays. So we need to think about that. Working together as a team, you know, that's really probably the strongest defence against compassion fatigue. Helping each other out with tasks. Supporting each other emotionally, listening to each other, actually listening. Debriefing and decompressing and focusing on our goals. So taking care of the carer, that's probably the take-home message. I do have an ulterior motive for being here today as well. Obviously this is really important to me, but has anyone heard of the professional quality of life? No? The professional quality of life is a survey scale that looks at compassion fatigue and compassion satisfaction, and so you can measure these qualities in yourself. It's available free online, but I've actually got one of these on the table for anybody who's interested in filling it out. The ones on your table actually, if you're happy to participate, are for my PhD thesis. So if you're interested in helping me out with that, I really appreciate you filling them out, and I can come around and collect them at the end. So in summary, accepting and acknowledging that compassion fatigue is a potential outcome of working with animals is certainly the first step in preventing compassion fatigue. Continue to evaluate the reasons why we chose to work with animals. Know that we can prevent compassion fatigue and burnout. Take pride in the skills that we have, do them and learn them to the best of our ability, be competent and caring. And certainly believing in the value that we add to the lives of those in our care. Supporting each other, taking care of ourselves, and the big one, celebrating success, which I think has resonated throughout pretty much every talk that we've had this week. Thank you.